When the king of late-night TV died, there was no funeral, no big Hollywood ceremony, no rows of black cars, no public place for the world to say goodbye. But in the quiet that came after, one name was repeated more than any other. It was the name of a guest nobody expected, a ghost from a past he tried to forget. Who was this person? And why did their story haunt the final chapter of Johnny Carson's life? On January 23, 2005, the man who had tucked America into bed for 30 years passed away. Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late-night TV, died quietly at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. The official reason was breathing failure caused by the lung disease he had been fighting. He was 79 years old. His nephew, Jeff Sotzing, released a simple, firm statement. He was surrounded by his family, whose loss will be huge. There will be no memorial service. The decision was shocking but totally fit his personality. For a man who lived in the public eye, performing for millions of people every night, Johnny Carson was super private. His friend and fellow host Dick Cavett once talked about how socially awkward Carson was, how he would struggle just to make small talk with a few fans outside the studio. Ed McMahon, his loyal sidekick for 30 years, famously said, "Johnny was comfortable in front of 20 million people and totally uncomfortable in front of 20. He was often called the most private public man who ever lived, so when he died, he got the privacy he always wanted. His body was cremated and the ashes were given to his wife, Alexis Mars. There would be no public gathering, no place for his famous friends and co-workers to share stories. The man, whose final show was watched by an amazing 50 million people, left this world with only a handful of witnesses. The world mourned in the only ways it could. Nice words poured in from the highest offices. President George W. Bush called him a steady and reassuring presence. Jay Leno, who took over The Tonight Show, called him the gold standard. And David Letterman, the man Carson himself saw as his true heir, gave maybe the most touching tribute. He said, "All of us who came after are pretenders. We will not see the likes of him again." Fans left flowers and notes on his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and at Johnny Carson Park, across the street from the NBC studios, where he had made magic for so long. But with no funeral, how could there be a guest? And in a life filled with thousands of people he knew and a few powerful enemies, whose name whispered after his death would have truly shocked everyone. The answer isn't about who was there, but about who was missing for so long. The unexpected guest wasn't a person who showed up that day. It was the ghost of a friendship so deep and a betrayal so bitter that it shaped the rest of both their lives. It was the story of the one person Johnny Carson could never, ever forgive. To understand the end, you have to go back to the beginning. Before she was a household name, Joan Rivers was a struggling comedian. By the early 1960s, she had been working for years in small clubs in New York's Greenwich Village, passing around a hat that sometimes didn't even come back. She had slept in her car, worked temporary jobs to pay the bills, and even got banned from the Jack Paar version of The Tonight Show after one appearance. She had tried out for Johnny Carson's Tonight Show 7 times and failed every single time. By 1965, at just 31 years old, many people in the industry were telling her that her career was already over. Then came the night of February 17, 1965. It was a mercy booking, something her manager set up as a favor because he also represented Bill Cosby. Rivers walked out onto that stage, convinced it was her last chance. But something incredible happened. She later remembered, "It was one of those nights where everything goes right, the stars line up, and the audience and I just connected." She wasn't just funny, she was electric, and the one person who mattered most saw it. As her set ended and she sat down on the special couch next to the host, Johnny Carson leaned in and said the words that would change her life forever. On national television, he told her, "You're going to be a star." Rivers remembered looking behind her, wondering who he could possibly be talking to. She described the on-air chemistry between them as absolutely magical. In that moment, a bond was created. Carson didn't just give her a break, he became her champion, her teacher. As she would say for years to come, he handed me my career. From that night on, Joan Rivers was a regular on The Tonight Show. She made nearly 100 appearances over the next 20 years. Their on-air banter was legendary. He was the cool, unshakable king, and she was the sharp, hilarious court jester who could make him genuinely laugh until he cried. His belief in her was real. When Rivers started her own short-lived daytime talk show in 1968, Johnny Carson was her very first celebrity guest, a massive show of support. Her role on the show grew and grew. She began filling in as a substitute host when Carson was on vacation, and by 1983, she was officially named the show's permanent guest host. This was a position of huge trust. When Johnny was away, the keys to the kingdom were hers. She was, in the eyes of the public and the industry, the queen in waiting. Her loyalty to Carson was total. She later said that she had received many offers to host her own program over the years, but always turned them down to stay with The Tonight Show. But here is the detail that changes everything. For all their on-air warmth, their relationship was almost entirely professional. It existed under the hot studio lights and in front of the cameras. Rivers herself wrote, "Our friendship existed entirely on camera in front of America." And even then, during the commercial breaks, when the red light went off, we had nothing to say to each other. This wasn't because they disliked each other, it was because of Carson's legendary distance. He was a man who built walls around himself. Theirs wasn't a relationship of close friends who shared secrets. It was a professional hierarchy. He was the king, the helper who had discovered her and given her a place in his court. And that unspoken power dynamic is the key to understanding the brutal betrayal that was coming. By the mid-1980s, the ground beneath Joan Rivers's feet began to feel shaky. For years, she had felt secure in her role as Carson's number two, but things started to change. In 1985, Carson signed a new 2-year contract with NBC. Rivers, however, was only offered a 1-year deal. To her, the message was clear. She wrote, "It could only mean one thing. The powers were uncertain about my future." Then came the bigger blow. A memo began going around at NBC, listing the names of comedians being thought about as possible permanent replacements for Johnny when he eventually decided to retire. Rivers, who had spent more hours in that chair than anyone besides Johnny himself, assumed her name would be at the top of the list. But when she saw it, she was crushed. Her name wasn't on it at all. She came to a painful conclusion. NBC would never give the host spot to a woman. She felt her role as guest host was a safe way for the network to use her talent without ever seeing her as a true competitor or replacement for the king. It was at this exact moment of weakness that a new player entered the game. A brand new network called Fox was preparing to launch, and its executives, including Barry Diller, wanted to make a huge splash. They approached Joan Rivers with an offer that was impossible to ignore. Her own late-night talk show, The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers. The show would air in the exact same time slot, directly opposite The Tonight Show, and the salary was a huge $10 million, many times what she was making at NBC. Rivers was faced with a painful decision. Her loyalty was to Johnny, the man who had made her, but she felt disrespected and thrown away by the network he worked for. Her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, gave her some important advice. He told her not to say a word to Carson until the contract with Fox was signed and finalized. His reasoning was based on cold, hard Hollywood logic. Other comedians who had been regulars on The Tonight Show and left to start competing shows were often immediately banned from appearing on Carson's program. If she told Johnny, and then the Fox deal fell through for some reason, she could be left with nothing. Even worse, they both feared that the famously powerful Carson could make one quiet phone call and kill her deal before it ever happened. So, she kept silent, a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. The weekend before the official announcement, the news leaked. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe, as two completely different versions of the story came out. According to Joan Rivers, she was horrified that he heard it from someone else. She immediately tried to call him to explain. She said she finally got him on the phone and told him she was leaving to host her own show on Fox. He said nothing. He just hung up. She called back, thinking they must have been disconnected. He hung up on her a second time. That was it. They would never speak again. Johnny Carson's version was totally different. He claimed that phone call never happened. He told people that he learned about her new show from a press release, just like the rest of the world. He felt completely blindsided, ambushed, and betrayed by the person he had championed for over 20 years. Why was his reaction so extreme? Other male comedians had left to do their own shows, and while there might have been tension, Carson had often given them his blessing. Rivers had her own theory, one that cut much deeper than simple professional competition. She later wrote, "I think he really felt because I was a woman that I just was his, that I wouldn't leave him. I think it was a question of, I found you and you're my property. He didn't like that as a woman. I went up against him." In Carson's world, a man leaving to compete was ambition. A woman leaving was treason. The king had been defied, and his anger would be swift and devastating. Johnny Carson, the most powerful man in television, used his power to punish her in every way he could. The first and most obvious result was that she was immediately and permanently banned from The Tonight Show. For the rest of Carson's time there, and even for years after he retired, she was not welcome. But it went much further than that. Carson created what was basically a blacklist. Anyone who appeared as a guest on The Late Show starring Joan Rivers was told they would no longer be welcome on The Tonight Show. For celebrities and their agents, the choice was simple. You could go on the struggling new show on the upstart network, or you could go on the most important and powerful show in television history. Almost everyone chose Carson. Rivers found it nearly impossible to book A-list guests. An NBC executive, a personal friend of hers, allegedly told her bluntly, "We are going to destroy you." The Late Show premiered on October 9, 1986, and almost immediately ran into trouble. Without big-name guests and facing the full force of Carson's ratings power, the show struggled. Behind the scenes, things were even worse. Rivers's husband Edgar, who was a producer on the show, fought constantly with Fox executives. After less than a year, the network gave Joan an ultimatum: fire her husband. She refused. So in May of 1987, Fox fired them both. The professional embarrassment was huge, but it was about to be overshadowed by an unimaginable personal tragedy. The failure of the show, the massive debts they had built up, and the public downfall put an unbearable strain on her marriage. 3 months after they were fired, Edgar Rosenberg took his own life. In the darkest moment of her life, Joan Rivers was completely alone. Her career was in ruins. Her husband was gone. And through it all, from the man who had once been her greatest champion, there was only silence. Johnny Carson never called. He never sent a note. He never expressed a single word of sympathy. This single act, or lack of one, changed the feud from a bitter Hollywood fight into a truly dark and tragic story. It showed a side of Carson that his adoring audience never saw, a man whose grudge was so deep that it overrode any sense of common decency or compassion. As Rivers would later say, describing her complete isolation from the world she once ruled, "It was like Stalin had sent me to Siberia." The king had passed his sentence, and it was absolute. Now let's return to that quiet day in January 2005. As the news of Johnny Carson's death spread, the story of his epic, unresolved feud with Joan Rivers was one of the first things that came to everyone's mind. She was the ghost that haunted his legacy, the one loose end that the master of control could never tie up. In the absence of a real funeral, her story became the eulogy he never got. She was the unexpected guest. Her reaction to his passing was as complicated and raw as their history. There was no simple statement of grief. Instead, her public comments were a tangled mix of lingering bitterness, deep hurt, and a surprising amount of professional respect. In one interview, she was brutally honest, calling him a mean son of a gun. But in the very next breath, she would add that he was also the most brilliant straight man ever. Nobody touches him. The pain was still fresh, even after nearly 2 decades of silence. She didn't express regret for taking the Fox show, but she did mourn the opportunity for grace that Carson had thrown away. In an interview given shortly before her own death, she imagined a different ending to their story. "What Johnny should have done," she said, "after the whole thing, after I left the show, and after I was fired from Fox, and after Edgar committed suicide, Johnny should have had me back on the show and said to me, 'Where have you been?' It would have made all the newspapers and we should have picked right up. It would have been a moment of forgiveness, a classy move from the classiest man on television." But it never happened. Even years after his death, Rivers was still searching for some kind of closure. On an episode of her reality show, Joan and Melissa, Joan Knows Best, she visited the cemetery where Carson's ashes were buried.